of the Levan Institute for the Humanities. Welcome to this conversation about the Becoming Black, Becoming Free by Ariela Gross and Alejandro de la Fuente. This is a collaboration between the Levan Institute, the Center for Law, History, and Culture at the University of Southern California, and also an opportunity to welcome our brand new Center for Latinx and Latin American Studies at USC. The Levan Institute for the Humanities, for us, this is the first of a new series of book chats where every month we will be featuring a recent book published by a USC author and a casual conversation among colleagues and, well, now on Zoom, colleagues near and far to get a chance to hear about books recently published by our colleagues at USC. I will also say that the Levan Institute for the Humanities is a very, very young institute. We started almost a year ago and had quite the eventful first year. So for many of you, this may be your first program for the Institute, and I want to make sure to paste the link to our website for anyone who is interested, and to invite you to subscribe to our newsletter through which we share not only the events that the Levan organizes, but the entire calendar of humanities-related events on campus. So that is my contribution to the proceedings, and I will turn it to my colleague Nathan Pearl Rosenthal, who will be moderating today's conversation. And thank you all for coming. It's exciting to see so many colleagues from so many different fields gathered around this book.
And now I start by making a rookie Zoom mistake of talking while muted. Thank you, Daniela. It's such a pleasure to see all of your faces, even if in tiny boxes. I'm Nathan Pearl Rosenthal. I'm an associate professor of history, social sciences, and law at USC. And as Daniela said, I'll be moderating the conversation today, though I plan to do that in a very moderate sort of way. I'm really going to first introduce our panelists briefly, and I do mean briefly because I could probably spend the entire session introducing these extremely distinguished scholars. And I'll then invite the three commentators on the book to speak for 10 minutes at most. And I'll then offer Ariela and Alejandro the opportunity to respond for a few minutes. And at that point, we'll open up the session for Q&A from everybody else. And we hope to have a good amount of time to do that. Just a couple of technical matters. Please keep your microphone on mute if you're not commenting on the book during the commentaries so that we don't get interrupted. Once it's time once the commentators have started speaking, I'll be keeping a queue of anyone who would like to ask a question or make a comment. I would prefer it, if possible, if you would use the blue hand raising button, which you can find under under participants, if I memory serves. So please use that to raise your hand. If you were not able to do it that way, you can chat me privately, or if it really is a dire situation, wave your arms around a lot and I'll hopefully see you and call on you. But please try to use the blue hand waving. And so you can start putting your hand up as soon as the commentators have started speaking, and I will keep the queue and call on you in order. So let's introduce our distinguished panelists in no particular order here, although the authors first. Alejandro de la Fuente is Robert Woods Bliss Professor of Latin American History and Economics at Harvard, where he's also Professor of African and African American Studies and of History, and directs the Afro-Latin American Research Institute. Our other author, distinguished author, is Professor Ariela Gross. She's the John B. and Alice R. Sharp Professor of Law and History at USC, where she's also a co-director of the USC Center for Law, History, and Culture. And here I'll just insert a tiny grace note about the CLHC, the Center for Law, History, and Culture, which is the co-sponsor, one of the co-sponsors of this event. The CLHC was in fact founded by Ariela, among others, and is a major national and even international center for the study of law, history, and law and humanities more broadly. In addition to this event, which is co-sponsoring, the CLHC will also be co-sponsoring, a series of conversations about racial justice throughout the fall. And so if you're interested in being part of those, with Daniela's permission, perhaps we'll drop a link into the chat as well for that. So we'll do that in a minute. All right, to proceed to our commentators. Michelle McKinley is the Bernard B. Clix Professor of Law at the University of Oregon, where she is also director of the Center for the Study of Women in Society. Adrienne Davis is the William M. Van Cleve Professor of Law at Washington University in St. Louis, where she is also director of the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity, and Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs and Diversity. And last but by no means least, Sven Beckert is Laird Bell Professor of History at Harvard. Those will be our three commentators, Professor McKinley, Professor Davis, and Professor Beckert, and they will speak, in fact, in that order. So I'm just going to show you the book before we proceed. Here it is in all of its glory. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Michelle McKinley to take it away.
Thanks. Can everybody hear me? Did I not make the rookie mistake of not muting myself? Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be able to comment on this book, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts about it and its impact on the field of Latin American legal history, comparative legal history, and the law of slavery. I thank the Levan Institute for the Humanities for all the work in setting this up. As someone who runs a center, I realize all the behind the scenes labor that makes these events work, even virtually, perhaps even more so, and wanted to recognize that labor. And of course, thanks to Sam Ehrman, who I see, and other colleagues in law and history that are co-sponsoring the event. So Indian maternal ancestry, racial identity trials, equity suits, self-purchase disputes and arrangements, coartación, travel to free soil, resistance to insalubrious climates, jurisdictional jostling, Christian baptism. All of these were the sort of top hits in the playlist of enslaved people's lawsuits in pressing for their liberty, to resist the breakup of their families, and to widen the breach between bondage and freedom. As the title suggests, Becoming Free, Becoming Black examines the fissures in the law to traverse a path from enslavement to freedom. This freedom rarely rested on fixed or secure foundations, hence the recourse to the law to clarify, buttress, and sustain one's emancipation. Comparative approaches to the study of law and freedom in the past had stressed a divergence between Latin America and the British Atlantic, using Louisiana as a case for contrast or continuity. As Becoming Free, Becoming Black points out, the situation on the ground revealed a striking degree of similarity across three sites and across time. Given the absence of a robust body of slave laws, enslaved people, for instance, in 17th century Virginia, advanced claims that resonated with Iberian or Cuban claims. The book tells a clear story about what the law of slavery was, how it came about, and how it functioned, and why it changed over time in three sites. A secondary title of the book could have been, quote, a survey of free people of color, since the presence of sizable communities of free people of color made a huge difference in the ability to sustain freedom claims or to navigate one's way from bondage to freedom. Hence, in all three sites, slaveholders and lawmakers, in a sense one and the same, repeatedly demonstrated serious attempts to crack down on the possibilities by which Black people could remain free within a slave society. Free people of color weakened the stability of the hyphen between Black and slave and Black and citizen. In societies deeply committed to and profoundly shaped by slavery, free people of color could be accommodated in exceptional circumstances, as jurists, as orators, as preachers, as soldiers, as saints, as intercessors. They could be exemplary citizens and an evidence of accommodation without threatening a socio-racial order. But outside of the exceptions, the legal paths to freedom were consistently limited. One of the ways that the authors trace these attempts at curtailing freedom is to examine local ordinances and decrees. Ordinances in the societies under review delimited all facets of Black social life, where Black people could sell wine, for instance, or hunt, or sell their wares, where they could gather and congregate to worship, whether they could ride a horse or a mule, and under what conditions they could bear arms, on the last only for His Majesty. One wonders whether this comparative view of local ordinances is chicken and egg. In other words, was it the behavior that prompted the decrees, or were legislators anxieties so high that they sought to preempt the behavior by outlawing it beforehand? The behavior prompting the decrees plainly demonstrates that Black people did not comply with these ordinances. The repeated nature of the promulgation suggests that very few people took these mandates seriously across the board, whether they came from the peninsula or from the capital, leading to the infamous response of obedezco pero no cumplo. I obey, but I won't comply, which actually in English loses some of its treachery, but whatever. Comparing ordinances leads to a particular view of Black agency, protagonism, and social life, and suggests that law was a tool of race making, as authors point out, as opposed to being solely a tool for claims making. I see the same ordinances issued from 16th century cabildos in the Americas during an early period of imperial consolidation. The constraints show that Black people did continue to dance, sell, gather, worship, and congregate, and live in ways that despaired white elite lawmakers of their fitness for citizenship. This was suggestive of a commitment to racial hierarchy that accompanied Iberians as they established colonies in the Indies. I personally am not 100% convinced that Iberians arrived with such fixed notions of Black debasement. In my own review of Iberian legislation, I see a variation in ordinances issued in the late 15th and early 16th century between sites like Sevilla and Huelva, and sort of laissez-faire types of decrees throughout Extremadura in places like Trujillo and Cáceres. Indeed, the most stringent decrees were in Granada, where Black people who came to the peninsula as part of the sub-Saharan trade, strained to distinguish themselves from Moriscos and position themselves as Black Christians. This kind of variation gave me pause, at least, to consider the full-throttled commitment to Black subjugation and debasement as part of the imperial plan. Turning from the law on the books to life on the ground, the authors weave together the official and judicial records with a careful attention to notarial and sacramental records where possible. They show the consolidation of custom and equity into law that respected certain rights even when the tides turned over time. Manumission and the concomitant right to seek a new owner never disappeared, although these rights became more fragile and conditional. through retrenchment in the continental, through retrenchment, though retrenchment, occurred in the French codes, they were outpaced by the legislative ban on manumissions in the continental US that tied individual manumission to the larger question of emancipation. Later on, fueled by fears of revolution, Bacon, Haiti, Nat Turner, and the threat of disposition, white slave owners conditioned manumission over movement or movement out of the territory or country altogether, as Martha Jones has shown in the case of repatriation. This quote unquote tipping point created real setbacks in Louisiana and Virginia for family integrity and for Black prosperity. Less so in Havana, where the numbers of free people of color were too large for repatriation and where manumission continued to be registered as a slave owner's right. In all three sites, however, we see that Black citizenship was undesirable, regarded as problematic, and incompatible with white liberal notions of political belonging. I also did want to make a few points about manumission along the lines of gender and age. Because of women's enslavement, slave owners were intent on retaining the quote unquote issue of their female slaves. Yet if you look across the board at manumissions, women far outpace the numbers of manumitted slaves vis-a-vis their male counterparts. Children are also freed in greater numbers, sometimes by grace, but more often by the efforts of family members to purchase children at a lower price. This, when you look at sacramental records, you see that womb enslavement also created conditions for freedom in the womb. And I believe it's important to tell that story about gender, domesticity, and the conditional precarity of children born to mothers in the process of self-purchase. The fact that legislative decrees mandated that self-purchase or coartación was an individual right not conferable to children in the womb is undermined by the evidence across many colonial sites. It is interesting to note that conditional manumission and womb emancipation were most prominent in societies with large communities of free people of color. So I think I'm getting to the end. I just wanted to bring up 2 points. First, I have to say Ariela and Alejandro have really they've done it. This is a comparative study of slavery in 3 sites. It's a real feat spanning different jurisdictions, plantation logics, and most importantly, languages. It serves as a model for future comparative work and collaboration. The authors acknowledge the decades of work that preceded this effort and thankfully avoided the title like New Approaches to the Field of X. But I'm nonetheless curious to know where you situate or where they situate this book in the field of comparative legal history and the less well-defined field of global legal history. Some years ago in the prefatory remarks to an unfortunately titled New Studies in the History of American Slavery, the late Stephanie Camp and Ed Baptiste sort of ruminated whether one could really talk about new studies or approaches in such a burgeoning and rich field. So this book, at least because I've known you guys for at least a decade, represents a distillation of a decade of knowledge and effort in your lives. And I'm interested to know sort of like what next? Like, what do we say about the future of the field? And then my final question relates to the politics of the archive, which as a comparative effort would speak very closely to this question. As historians of the Iberian world, we are privileged, and I just say we in the like weird grammar, are privileged, if not overly endowed with archival sources. Our colleagues in the British Atlantic often resort to critical fabulations to reconstruct the lives of enslaved people using documents that often portray the darkest hours of the slave trade. This has led many scholars to critique the archive of slavery or reject it outright as a place of death, lies, and violence for Black lives that presages our present condition of Black death. Our archives are not tombs. They are full of cacophonous voices, sometimes too many voices. The story, for instance, that you all allude to of Maria Luisa Coleta and her 4 children tell a tragic story of flight, revolution, jurisdiction, wrongful enslavement, the lackluster performance of the law, and an aging friar. But we don't need critical fabulation to do that. It's all there in this this record. Could we intervene in this dialogue to offer a productive or at least generative critique between communities, scholarly communities, not by offering another microhistory or unearthing another example of slavery, of agency and protagonism in the archive? Instead, I'd like to know what it would mean for our historiographical tradition as scholars of slavery to take this kind of archive seriously. So I didn't get like a 10-minute warning or anything like that, but with this, I'm going to turn it over, I think, at this point to Adrienne. All right, well, thank you.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle.
Was I on time? Did I
You're good.
do it
You're good.
in the 10
you
minutes?
Did it. You did it. You did it. And I wanted to also report that the queue has begun. So if you have thoughts and stimulated by that that presentation, please do raise your hand. All right, and on to Adrienne.
Great, wonderful. I really wish that we were all together in person, but I have to say, just a moment, let me just, still navigating the Zoom, going back and forth here. Here we go. So I was really looking forward to us all being together in person in April, but I have to admit that I feel like I needed to reread this book, and I needed, I think, to be in this space even more now in this moment of Black death and just relentless Black death and important but exhausting racial resistance. So I have to say that this book was a really welcome elixir to sort of look back at really important recountings of earlier moments of people where we're really, I think, encountering and embracing Black agency. So it's just, I want to just sort of say that to all of us. So Ariela and Alejandro's book I found it to be a model of inspiring collaboration. I loved how the book seamlessly integrates their shared passion for disrupting conventional understandings of racial constructs, their shared appreciation of archival materials. And Michelle, I love how you just characterized it. And I think the Ariela and Alejandro are giving us some hope for new approaches to this archive. And they also share an approach to the law that's driven by critical lenses and theoretical constructs. And indeed, I think they offered a beautiful interweaving of the law in the books and the law on the ground, of claims making, and equally importantly of the sets of facts that Black people sort of insisted on, that they crafted their lives around, the facts that gave rise to the claims making, which in turn, of course, drove the formal legal responses, which in turn engendered new sets of facts that generated new sets of claims. So I think the book is just a beautiful example of how one can be attentive to both of those things, and how operating at both levels then really enhances each. Excuse me. So I found succinct and very right their argument that the law of freedom did as much to shape race as the law of slavery. For obvious reasons, many of us pivot to the law of slavery and really documenting its excessive brutalities, its absurdities, its Kafkaesque qualities, its paradoxes, its hypocrisies. There is so very much to do there. That project continues. But I think that Ariela and Alejandro's pivot to the law of freedom as the necessary analog, ancillary and complementary to the law of slavery, is such incredibly important work. And as is true of the best comparative work, their book helps us understand how the law of freedoms function and how the operation of race, we understand both of those better in each of the contexts of the United States and Cuba, and specifically within the context of the US of Louisiana and Virginia. I also appreciate very much, again, especially in this historic moment in the United States, their excavation, I think, of a brilliant project, undertaking of a national project of Black debasement. And that's a phrase that I continue to really sort of think about a lot over the course of this this summer. And I think it's really, truly one of it captures beautifully, I think, the collective national project of the United States. And I also appreciated very much their foregrounding of Native Americans and their work as obviously as individuals and as populations, but also as tribes that revealed their differing roles in the law of freedom. The differing roles that the law of freedom played in nation building in the United States and in Cuba. So they use all of this, the mutually constitutive nature of freedom and the racial order, the project of Black debasement in the United States, and the project of nation building to revisit many of the old war horses that we continue to hold about slavery and about race, many of the old chestnuts. Some of them I think that they thoroughly disrupted, and others they cast them in a more nuanced light. The entire set of histories that they embrace, the histories of law, the histories of slavery, the histories of the American South, the histories of race, sort of the emerging field, the histories of freedom, and I suspect also, although I'm not a scholar of the field, the histories of Cuba and Latin America, all are cast in new light that not only are we getting, I think, fresh takes on it, but also raises, as Michelle said, brand new sets of research questions that will continue, I think, to drive all of us for many years to come. So I wanted to focus on two sets of insights and end hopefully with just a couple of questions, but two sets of insights that I very much appreciated about their work. And one set of insights is focused on economics and the other on gender. So in terms of the economics of this, or the economics insights with which they are engaging, they disrupt, I think, several. They draw our attention first, I think, to the importance of economic personality. It's a term I use sometimes when I'm talking about Black reparations. So they, I think, really draw our attention beautifully to the meaning and the scale of Black personality in these different societies, in contrasting Cuba and the United States, but also contrasting to an extent Louisiana and Virginia. And they really show us, I think, in very deep and rigorous form, how the different economic personality that is bestowed, invited, permitted, authorized, encouraged in these different societies itself has much to do, excuse me, in terms of how the law of freedom, how the meaning of freedom and also the law of freedom is constructed. They point out that both the scale and the economic power of the free Black community in Cuba gave them access to the development of a law of freedom that would be unprecedented in the United States. They also overturn, and draw into question some of the received wisdoms that I think other historians have begun to challenge, but I think that they do it in some ways in more powerful and persuasive ways. The conventional norm that many people continue to hold, that enslaved men had more economic power, more economic personality than enslaved women, and the conventional understanding that for many enslaved Black women, their freedom or their economic personality came from complex sexual relationships in which they might be engaged. But they show that the experience in Cuba really disrupts that and overturns and upends our understanding of that, right? That we encounter there enslaved Black women as themselves as market earners who operated, excuse me, who operated as entrepreneurs in very complex and robust markets. By the same token, when we tend to think about enslaved Black women and the ways that they might broker intimacy in order to secure access to economic resources, to achieve economic personality, to secure freedom, we often typically would think immediately about the complexity of sexual relationships. But they point out that women are operating in the intimate economies of the household, and that frequently the people who are enabling their economic resources and empowering their manumission are not white men, but white women. And I will return to that. Let me try to wrap up here. In contrast, Black Americans operated much more so in economies of persuasion. And I'll just say there that I thought was very intrigued by this idea that these required performances both that, of course, people were trying to disrupt slavery's logic by seeking freedom, but it often ended up reiterating slavery's logic by these performances of the faithful slave, the loyal slave, etc. They also operated, these slaveholders operated in ratification economies as well, and I'll sort of leave it at that. I want to sort of just take a moment though, and because one of the things that I really appreciated was how their book, taken together, how it really, I think, disrupts how we might understand the hydraulics of gender under slavery, right? So we see that women are able to forge a meaningful connection, relationships for themselves in the market. We also find, I found this to be very intriguing, the higher rates of manumission among women resulted in more free Black people because of the roles that the status followed the mother. So hence what some people might view as sort of exploitative relationships paradoxically generated larger cohorts of free Blacks. And we also find that white women frequently did favor Black slaves, that it wasn't all the sort of the jealousy of was sort of rendered by some early historians of interracial intimacy, but some white women in the context of the intimacy economies of the household did forge meaningful bonds. The last thing I will, let me try to do two different things I could say at the end. So I'll say that for me, as someone who works on what I call the sexual political economy, their book very much raised, I think, new ways in which I want to consider and delve into just sort of distributive justice within this overlay of sex and political economy. And I'll just end with three very quick questions. First, I really liked very much that you focused on plantation societies and the specific set of insights that you draw from them. I was curious because, of course, plantation societies had very unique sets of elites and very unique labor economies. On the other hand, they were culturally very aspirational for whites who, both elite whites and non-elite whites who did not live on our own plantations. And I was curious what your sense was of the sort of the scalability or the universality of sort of the insights that you draw here. The second is, that's kind of a macro question. Much more micro question is, I was curious when you sort of in passing characterized Plaçage as marriage-like. I've always thought of it much more, teach contracts. I thought of it as much more, not to deny the meaningful intimacy, but I thought of it as much more transactional, especially because of the role of parents in brokering the arrangement. So I was curious about that. And if there's any time, I would love, love, love to get your take on Isabel Wilkerson's new book on caste.
Thank you so much. And thank you for observing the time limit. Thank you. All right. The queue is growing. Please put your hand up if you would like to have your name on the list. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Sven Beckert.
Thank you so much, Nathan. And thank you so much also, Alejandro and Ariela, for inviting me to this discussion. I think we all agree, as everyone has said now, this is a truly inspiring book. It deals with an important topic that I think is particularly important right now at this particular moment when all too often the idea of race and the idea of racism is almost seen in a historical manner. And you bring a deep historical perspective again to this problem. It is a beautifully executed book. It is beautifully researched. I mean, the archival research behind what you're presenting here is truly impressive. And what I find particularly impressive about the book is that it's built upon the richness of archival resources, but at the same time, the archival resources are not overwhelming the narrative and the argument of the book. So the arguments are always front and center, even though you do draw on a huge variety of extremely important documents. So I think this is a really beautiful book. It's a beautiful read. I really enjoyed working my way through it. And what I found particularly impressive about the book, and I'm just going to list, I think, 5 things, and then I'm going to have a couple of questions that I want to raise, which might inspire you to write yet another book on this topic. So what I think is of course really wonderful is the most general take on slavery, namely that you historicize slavery, which seems kind of a self-evident thing, but as many of you know, many studies on slavery actually don't do that. They write on slavery kind of as a generic thing, especially in the context of the history of the United States. But you, like Ira Berlin did before you really emphasize the change over time in the institution of slavery, and you also very much emphasize variety between different places. And I'm going to come back to this in a little while. Then what I really liked about the book is that you know, especially recent works on the history of slavery in the United States have very much gone to the plantation, and they have looked at the social, economic, political dynamics on the plantation, which I think is a really important contribution to the debate. But what you do is you step a little bit away from that again, and you instead look at the kind of legal construction of enslavement and the legal construction of freedom and the legal construction of race. And in some ways, the law itself takes on an important force in defining the institution of slavery and changing the institution of slavery as time goes by. So it historicizes it, it emphasizes change over time. It does emphasize the importance of the law and thus of the state in the institution of slavery. Again, much of the recent literature is very much focused on the dynamic on the plantation, but you bring the state, institutions of the state, very much into the center of this debate. And then the law is not just some institution out there that is deployed by the state, but I think you do a beautiful job in showing that the law is actually that Black people, enslaved and free, play a very crucial role in constructing this law, or enforcing the state to construct certain kinds of laws. And the collective activities and the individual activities of enslaved people and freed Black people in the Atlantic world actually makes a decisive difference in writing the law of slavery and writing the laws of freedom. And I'm going to come back to this as well later. And then on the kind of the broadest possible canvas, as Michelle already mentioned, you know, this is comparative history of the finest kind. I think somehow comparative history has become somewhat unfashionable, or people don't do it very much anymore. But you do it, but you do it in a subtle way. I mean, you don't create tables with, you know, Cuba here, Louisiana here, Virginia there, and then 3 columns, and you fill it in. But you tell a narrative around this comparative story that you're telling, and I think you do so in a beautiful way, and you emphasize both similarities and differences, and I think what you especially end up arguing very powerfully is of why the United States takes on the particular the understanding of race and the particular prominence of racial thinking that it does in a new kind of way. So I thought this was one of the most important arguments of the book that came out of this comparative perspective. But then it's not just a comparative perspective, but it's also a global, or at least an Atlantic perspective. So it's part of this trend of writing global history. And I think what I mean, you don't make much of it, you know, that you don't, you know, as somebody else said, you don't overemphasize what's new and the departure and the novel approach. You know, you're more subtle. But I think what is really important, that what you show is that there is really just one history of slavery and one history of the struggle against slavery, that this is all connected, and that this can not only be better understood from a comparative perspective, but this can only be understood from a connected perspective as one history that has different kinds of articulations in different parts of the world, but is still one history of slavery and one history of anti-slavery and black politics, the politics that is very much related to one another. So because the book is so beautifully executed and because it's so clearly argued, you know, this can be a virtue, but it can also be a problem for authors, because then, you know, if your audience understands right away what is this you want to say, then they are, you know, they always have ideas how you could possibly do it differently or what other questions that raises. And basically the book was so powerful and it raised so many important issues in such a clear manner that basically, in my mind, it raised like another slew of questions that are outside the frame of this book, but maybe they are part of the next book you're going to co-author a few years from now. So one is kind of a smaller issue, but I'm really out of my waters here because I don't know anything about Spanish history. But of course, the big question you raise is why that difference? Why is Cuba so different from Virginia, and somehow Louisiana is like in the middle of it all? But so why is Cuba so different? And I read that very carefully, and you don't come out immediately to say, okay, this is the explanation. Like there's not like a one paragraph explanation at the beginning for that. But in the end, at the very end of the book, I think you do emphasize that basically it's the long-term Spanish legacy thinking about slavery coming out of the Middle Ages that somehow, you know, is transported to Cuba, and it has such staying power. There's such a past dependency that this continues way into the 19th century. And this explains why Cuba is different. That might be true. I really don't know anything about Cuba, but I was wondering, you know, if I think about Rebecca Scott's arguments about, for example, the different geography of Cuba, you know, than from, like, let's say Virginia, does that play a role in explaining the different trajectories? Or I was also wondering, so when you look at the United States, you start out in the 18th century with a weak new nation state, but that nation state is on a strengthening trajectory as time goes by. It becomes quite powerful by the 1830s, 1840s. And the slavery is part of the strengthening nation state. In Cuba, slavery is really part of a kind of rapidly disintegrating empire. So I wonder if that might not be another reason of why the trajectory of slavery and freedom and the law of freedom and slavery might be somewhat different in Cuba than in the United States. I mean, that's just a wide guess. But what I want to say is it might make, I would encourage you to think about this again, and maybe, I mean, intuitively, I would say maybe, you know, not put too much, not all that emphasis on the like 15th century history of Spain in explaining the 19th century outcome in Cuba. So that's my first suggestion for the next book. The other one was, the book obviously has a strong urban focus, partly because many of the sources are being created in cities, and of course many, almost all free people, as you show, especially in Virginia and in Louisiana, but to some degree also in Cuba, lived in cities. And I just wondered if this emphasis on the urban doesn't slightly it doesn't miss kind of a big part of the history of slavery, including the legal construction of slavery and freedom. You know, I think you make a real effort trying to take the story into the countryside. I mean, in the text, I noticed that you really seem to be looking for cases that come out of the countryside. But I just I think that could have been made a little clearer. And then what I was wondering is, so I think you make a really brilliant argument about the law being important and the law being partly shaped by the collective and individual actions of free people and enslaved people. I think that's beautiful. But now looked at from the perspective of enslaved and free Black people in the Atlantic world, I wonder if one could not see the struggle over the law more as part and parcel of a larger political project of the enslaved and of free people of color. So, I mean, I'm sure you will agree with that. And there's a lot of evidence for that. So, for example, when you write about La Escalada in Cuba in the 1840s, clearly that has an amazing impact on the law of slavery that follows. But of course, there is a response in the law. But of course, it's also part of a larger repertoire of political action of enslaved people throughout the Atlantic world. So is Saint-Domingue. I mean, Saint-Domingue has a huge impact on all of that. But Saint-Domingue generates fear among white people, but it does also generate a lot of inspiration and politics of anti-slavery among enslaved people all over the Atlantic world, as I think you do say. But I just wonder, how can you think about the law as part of the political life and the political strategies of Black people throughout the Atlantic world? And then maybe last but not least, I would like us to think maybe a little bit more about the trajectory of slavery in the Atlantic world. In some ways, you show quite well that, and that's one of the core arguments of the book, is that freedom becomes ever more difficult to attain in all of these places, and becomes ever more limited, and freedom. And the position of enslaved people, but also free people of color, becomes more difficult in Cuba, and especially in the United States. But what does that say about the institution of slavery? I mean, isn't that in a way an expression of the deep crisis of slavery in the mid-19th century? It seems like as if it's these planters and these local colonial officials in Havana, or the governors in Virginia, that they become ever more powerful and they can do these kinds of things. But in another way, I would tend to read that as, in a way, I would tend to read it as a sign of the strength of Black revolutionary politics in the Atlantic world and the weakness of the world of planters and colonial governors who are defending the institution of slavery. But so I was just wondering about the trajectory of slavery in all of that. But look, this I think that's really stuff for another book. But the book is beautiful, and it raises these questions because it's so brilliantly clear and so brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sven, for rounding out our commentators. I'm going to ask Ariela and Alejandro to respond as briefly as they can bear, so that we can have time to address questions from the many scholars and students and others in the audience today. So Ariela, I believe you're going to take it away.
We've been fighting in the chat, so I guess Alejandro won and I'm going first. But I really want to thank all of you for really such insightful and provocative comments. I've taken multiple pages of notes, and so obviously can't respond to all of these questions. And in particular, I'm going to save our discussion of Isabel Wilkerson for offline, because I feel like that would take me on a long tangent. But I wanted to respond just to a couple of really interesting points. So one was the politics of the archive, and just thinking about the archive right now, and thinking about the much fraught term of agency. And, I've been very influenced by reading Marisa Fuentes and other historians looking to think about how to read an archive, against the grain and all of the silences in an archive, as you say, of death and of silence and of violence. And in many ways, I think all of us working in the legal history of slavery are in one way or another trying to put intention or recognize the problematic of kind of looking for the voices. I mean, I think of so many panels that you and I, Michelle, have been on about finding the voices of enslaved people, or about Black agency, and or hearing the subaltern speak. I mean, so many, one way or another, we're all trying to uncover things we may never, a consciousness and experience we may never fully have access to. But I must say that in this moment, more than ever, a moment when it's really just hard to wake up and open the newspaper. I mean, I almost, you almost can't bear it, what's happening. That I think there is just a tremendous hunger to find those examples and read those examples of people who in the most difficult and constrained of circumstances made incredible use of the resources that I was going to say available to them, but are hardly available, that they wrested from the state, And so in that sense, I almost makes me want to go back and just reclaim agency. Yes, that's what we're seeing. That's what we're experiencing here. And then, the other thing I wanted to say was just something about change over time. And this is a response, I guess, to Sven's first question, which made me think, oh, maybe we weren't as clear as we meant to be. because I certainly don't think, I think we do think that legal tradition is important, right? We start with the fact that not only legal but social precedents were available to the Spanish that weren't available to the English, in the same way that they come to the colonies with practices of enslavement and of lawmaking that have them ready to go when they arrive, and yet. We see, and part of why we are really trying to map, those centuries, a real, very important changes over time, because that doesn't automatically, it's certainly not a constant and continuous movement from the 15th to 19th century. And in fact, it's, to me, kind of the irony, and the one that I, as a U.S. citizen at this moment, am struck by over and over, is that it's at that revolutionary period when, in fact, enslaved and free people around across the Americas are inspired and activated by the possibilities of emancipation. It's the moment of the expansion or even explosion of freedom across the Americas. And it's the moment where it really seems possible that Virginia and Louisiana will look like Cuba. That very moment, when the U.S. is becoming a republic, that the politics of the republic in the U.S. are what makes manumission become associated with emancipation more generally, and makes it so much more threatening to the republic, so much more threatening to the slavery institution in the United States, and requires that kind of backlash and crackdown that doesn't succeed in Cuba. And so if I had to say, I would say politics more than than demography, than economics, than legal tradition. I would say politics, but I'm going to throw it to Alejandro, and I know he has a few thoughts as well. But thank you, all of you.
Thank you. I'm unmuted, right? You can hear me, right? Thank you so much for all those comments and for your kind words about the book. You know, writing a book like this is quite an intellectual adventure. It took us more years than we would care to admit about the process of, you know, first writing a few papers together. I always say that I didn't know it at the time, but Ariela was really worried that I couldn't write in English properly. She was terrified about that. She didn't tell me until like many years later. Anyway, so it was quite a process intellectually we were coming from different traditions. We were coming from somewhat, we shared many things in common, including spaces in which we would come together, which is the beauty of bringing together scholars who specialize on different areas, but are dealing with somewhat similar questions. And several people in this group know a thing or two about that. So I'm personally, frankly, flattered when I hear that you think that the book came out, that it reads well and that you can follow the story. We ended up, we never really, each of us would write a chapter regardless of place. So we would write a whole draft, each of us, and then we would send the chapters back and forth. And if you ask me today who wrote a certain paragraph, I would be hard pressed to in fact say who did it, because there were so many versions. So there was a process of writing this together and putting and getting to arguments together that has a history of its own. I want to go back to the question that Sven asked about what's the difference, because I think that connects very well with Michelle's question about the place of the book in the historiography, and with Adrian's observation about Black debasement. I think these things are, so to us really, you know, if one had to, and it's a fair question, we ask our students to say, okay, give me the 3-sentence version of the argument of your dissertation, right? So it's only fair that we have to do the same thing. In a sense, what we are saying here is that yes, that there is a tradition of manumission in the Iberian world, but what matters is not that tradition per se, is that legal practice is not tied to race-making purposes in the Iberian world. This is a legal practice that is not tied to the construction of a racial order. Whereas in Louisiana and Virginia, the possibility of escaping slavery from the very beginning gets intertwined with race-making anxieties and with race-making purposes. And therefore, the central contradiction of Iberian slave law, which is that on the one hand, it pioneers the creation of a racial order since the 16th century, and at the same time allows the continuation of a practice and a legal institution that undermines that racial order, because it allows people of African descent to escape, to use all kinds of find spaces, produce spaces, create mechanisms, avenues to escape from enslavement, and therefore results in the creation of a community of free people of color. Therefore, people who, of course, undermine the very debasement with which the law inscribes blackness from the 16th century. The Iberians, in a sense, it's Tannenbaum on its head, because the Iberians lead the way in actually creating these racial spaces in which blackness equals social debasement. So, and that helps to answer, at least in part, Michelle's question about where do we see the book in the scholarship. You know, this is not a new question, of course. This is actually a fairly old question. And, you know, we began, to be frank, we began the book thinking that we would write a book on comparative slave law. And we ended up writing a book, not so much on slave law, but on the law of freedom and free people of color, because we realized that this was not a question about an Anglo-Saxon slave system versus an Iberian slave system, a Latin slave system. What we realized was, first, this incredible commonality of race and the law, and then how that commonality worked out differently in different spaces. So that's one, I think that's one way to think about where the book fits within the general comparative scholarship. And the other, which all of you mentioned, is that of course we didn't want to produce another top-down kind of comparative work in which we really wanted to take advantage, and we are in depth intellectually, and we are beneficiaries of the enormous amount of legal and scholarship and local social histories of slavery and freedom that have been produced in the last 30 years. You know, after all that scholarship, it really would have been, it really didn't make any intellectual sense to try to produce another top-down comparison. We really wanted to build this, and both Ariela and I, all of our previous work was actually very much in tune with that. I mean, we have participated, like many of you, including some of our colleagues who commented today, in this scholarship from the bottom up, trying to understand how enslaved people made the law, how they created legal meanings, legal spaces, and in some cases, like with Coartación in Cuba, entire legal figures that didn't exist in any written code. So that's one way to think about the book on the wider scholarship. And I'm going to leave it there because I know there are questions, and there is no way to answer all your good questions. We would need a lot of time here. Nathan, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Alejandro. We are in the entirely expected, frankly, situation of being very, very rich in questions and ideas and very low on time. So what I'm going to ask us to do is to pose two questions at a time. And if you have a comment instead of a question, that's also okay. So I'm going to invite Professor Daria Rothmeyer and then Professor Joanne Flores Villalobos, both USC, to ask their questions.
Thank you so much, Nathan. And I apologize. I actually have to go and get ready for class at some point. So if I disappear, that's why. So I'm so excited to have this group of people, in large part because I'm a huge fan of everyone's work, but particularly Sven's work. And I want to ask Sven and Ariela and Alejandro to have a conversation, perhaps, in a way that draws on that work. And in particular, with regard to this question of why is Cuba different from Virginia? Because I wonder whether the answer is in political and labor economy. This is the conversation I've had with Ariela. That maybe part of the explanation for the differences might be the differing rate at which the cotton economy scales up from farm to plantation in these different places. The barrier to freedom becoming more porous in places where the scaling up is not yet fully underway, and more restrictive in places where the scaling up is in full swing. I don't know enough about the different rates of startup launch in these different places, but I know Sven does, so I'm hoping that you all will have a conversation to answer that question.
Hi, thank you so much for all these wonderful comments. I have like tons of scribbled notes that I'm going to try to make into a question. So I want to thank Adrian and then Ariela for bringing this again about kind of our current moment and how that applies. And to connect this back to the question of agency, which I want to go back to. Obviously your work is trying to do that really well. I see that focus in the introduction. You start with these three great stories that foreground the agency of Black people. But I wanted to think about it in conversation with some newer scholarship that has taken, in the period of slavery and emancipation, that has taken a much more kind of Afro-pessimist turn, right? That thinks about that de-emphasizes agency and instead thinks about the centrality of anti-Black violence to legal frameworks, which connects to our current moment, right? Where we're seeing a situation that, as kind of Sylvia Wynter would suggest, Black people are perceived as non-humans, as non-rights-bearing citizens, and that seeking solutions through legal frameworks is a kind of futile act, right? Since they are centered around anti-Black violence. So I was just kind of wondering about your thoughts about this debate. Where do you fall, and what lessons do you think your work can have for us in this moment? Thank you.
Are we gonna, or should we answer, Nathan?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to respond to the second question first, and thank you for that question. It's something that's been on my mind a lot, and it's funny because I've thought about a lot about our book in relation to my dear friend and colleague, Martha Jones' book, Birthright Citizens. Martha is here today. And where actually I feel like we're the pessimists, because looking in a legal history that hers is much more concentrated on in the 19th century, but looking at the ways free people of color are claiming citizenship. I always, a lot of when I thought about how we were writing, I was thinking we end up being much more pessimistic about the chances to claim citizenship that people in the United States, in Virginia and Louisiana have, compared to the way Martha talks about people's citizenship claims in Baltimore. And that was the back and forth I felt like in writing about that period is how much do we really end up emphasizing how hard, the walls closing in, the incredible brute force that white Virginians in Louisiana are bringing to bear on people who are making these claims. And so I felt like we were being pessimistic, although I think that you're right, that there is a literature that that is even more pessimistic. And I have to say that I've learned a lot from that work, but I find much of it, which isn't much of it, ahistorical. Much of what's written, when I think of that tradition, I think more of the 13th and the new Jim Crow, and I don't see. I worry about flattening the history and the possibilities that people did grab for, and so I can't take it that far, I guess, but I'd love to hear more of your thoughts another time.
So, anti-Black violence is the common denominator of these societies. That's really what makes them, that's the one story that Sven was talking about. So the question then goes back to the question that Daria was asking, so why is it that with this common denominator we have different, and there are probably other possible answers. We didn't really look at economic variables, to be frank. It was just not within our purview of research, but we did choose 3 societies that became mature plantation societies, slave plantation societies in the 19th century. If anything, Cuba underwent a spectacular transformation between the mid-18th century and the mid-19th century in terms of expansion of enslaved labor force and the growth of a slave-based plantation economy. So Cuba should have been one ideal place to find the collapse of whatever traditional arrangements may have existed. The fact that it did not quite happen, not very much despite the impulse and the political desires of slave owners and colonial officials, has a lot to do with the size of a community of free people of color. That community, there are early 19th century private documents in which Spanish officials lament that it's too late, that they let manumission go on for too long, and now they have to deal with this population. I mean, they actually look at the US South with envy. That's exactly what they should do, but they know that they cannot politically, the Spanish crown cannot politically do that without provoking a major social cataclysm in Cuba. So in some ways, by the late 18th century, by the age of revolution, it's just too late. There is a community, that community has institutions, is powerful and large enough to resist the onslaught that it did experience during the 19th century.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Professors Martha Jones and Alice Baumgartner to pose their questions now. However, in the interest of avoiding a different kind of social cataclysm, I do want to point out that we are running up against a pre-approved time limit. So for those who need to go, you leave, of course, with our blessing, but for those who can stay, we'll stay on for perhaps another 10 minutes to round out this discussion. So if I can call on Professor Jones and Professor Baumgartner.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you, Ariela and Alejandro, for the book and for inviting us to be part of this conversation. My question is about how you all grappled with differing, distinct, perhaps, historiographic routes to this study. And I'm especially interested in what happens when you begin to move, if you will, away from perhaps what we might think of as the heart of slavery studies and into Black history. I could probably narrate some route from the US perspective, though I'm interested in how Ariela navigated that. And Alejandro, I confess I don't know anything about what it would mean to posit this as Black history and not the history of slavery, and out of what literature and what historiographies you all think this is coming from. I ask this because I think that my graduate students are, yes, interested in critical fabulation. That's another conversation. But they are also interested in what I think they would term the communities of accountability. And so I think I'm interested in to know to whom you think this history is accountable. Perhaps the answer is historiographic, perhaps it's something beyond historiography. And thank you again.
Thanks so much to everyone for this wonderful panel and discussion. I have a more process-related question, because historians just don't really collaborate that much, although there are a number of exceptions on this Zoom call. And Alejandro already talked about your process of writing collaboratively, but I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about how that worked when you were coming up with the ideas behind this book, with the research behind this book, and whether you think that more collaboration of this sort is a way to be able to do this really bottom-up comparative history. And I of course think it is. Thanks.
Do you want to go first, or you?
You go, please.
Okay.
You handle the hard questions and leave the easy ones for me, please.
Martha, thank you. You always ask me the hardest questions. I appreciate it. I don't know if I don't know if I think about, I guess that is one thing about legal history, where, and bringing the state in, that as much as we're trying to get at individuals' experience with legal institutions and interactions with legal institutions, I don't really feel like it's doing the kind of history that I would place kind of squarely in the Black history tradition, because I do think about that as so much more social, and that there'd be so much more I'd want to try to know about people's lives if I could, if I were writing in that tradition. But I do think, you know, it's an effort to tell a kind of legal history of Blackness, and it's an effort to try to understand white supremacy in the law, and many of the ways in which Black people experience legal institutions. And so I guess when I think about a community of accountability, I am thinking about, I'm personally certainly thinking about people in the United States. So I'm certainly imagining an audience in the United States of both, you know, of people who want to get some purchase on that, some understanding of the role law played in creating these structures. And in particular, I guess I think about my students who are often asking in one way or another, we're trying to tell our parents and our neighbors and our friends what we mean by systemic racism. We don't know how to put that right into words. You know, we're making these connections, and they don't. I was just in actually visiting someone else's class yesterday, but a student asked me that, how do I tell people what I mean by systemic racism? And I guess that's what I'm hoping to get across, is like, how is the law creating these structures? And that's what we mean by systemic racism. It's not a collection of racist people. It's not a bunch of racist individuals. It's about systems and structures. And so that's what I'm hoping that'll be available to anybody, not just scholars. And
it's a great question, and in my own case, in the last, I don't know, now 30 years, I've worked with a lot of race justice activists from all over Latin America, including Cuba. I mean, these people are colleagues. I've learned from them. I frequently follow their lead intellectually in terms of questions and things to think about. And one of the questions that has always concerned me as a scholar is just the sheer power of race as a category of difference, and how Blackness, you know, I grew up in what was, by some metrics, a fairly egalitarian society, you know, post-revolutionary Cuba. And yet this category of difference was as socially meaningful. It operated differently than in Charleston or in Richmond or whatever, but it was, as a category of difference, was as meaningful and as real as it is here in the United States. And that is something that has informed basically everything I've written about in the last now more decades than I care to acknowledge. So I think in some ways, sometimes that is explicitly acknowledged, sometimes not. In my case, I'm happy to explicitly acknowledge an enormous debt of intellectual gratitude to activism, because, you know, when I created the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at Harvard, the first thing I did was to organize a meeting with activists from the Afro-descendant movement from Latin America. I asked them to come, and I told my colleagues, shut up and listen. Let them tell us what they need from academia. How can we answer? And I think one of the things that we need to really deal with is the question that Blackness is not a given, that being Black is a historical product. It's a product of power and colonialism and enslavement. And that gets lost frequently in the conversations we have about racial justice. And I think that's something that both Ariela and I shared. And this goes back then to Alice's question. It facilitated the collaboration, Alice, because we were coming from different traditions. We were coming from different historiographic traditions. We had read, but we shared something absolutely fundamental in common, which was this concern about racism, racial structures, racial subordination, and that created that made it easier for us to talk about. Now, that's like the nice story. The other side of the actual collaboration is that we would fight endlessly. I mean, I remember once we must have spent like 3 weeks debating one sentence. At some point, I think I told her, you know what, Ariela, whatever. Can we move on and we'll revisit the sentence like next month or something? I mean, we would fight. We would have, she would, I would send her a draft. She won, of course. I lost the battle. That goes without saying. But we would, I would write a draft. I would send it to her. We would not comment. We would rewrite our writing, which is a very tough thing to do for historians because, we produce our texts and then we want to protect those texts. We don't want to let them go. They're perfect. They're brilliant. Who could do it better? And then you send it to your colleague and your colleague said, he doesn't know what on earth he's talking about. And she would rewrite everything. She would send it to me. I would read and say, she has no idea what she's writing about. I would rewrite her and send it back to her. And I suppose after 6 or 7 of those back and forths, we would simply get tired and say, okay, it's probably, so it was a process. But to go back to your good point about whether we should do more of this, absolutely. We work in such isolation. And if you want to really produce this kind of, I always wanted to write this book. I always knew I couldn't write it because I just didn't have enough time in my life to learn the whole historiography of slavery and the law in the United States in order to do this. I would have to do one of these kind of historical sociology, very broad, interesting, provocative, valuable texts, but not the kind of bottom-up social histories of the law that I wanted to do. And I think that only through collaboration you can produce this kind of scholarship. So I do think we should encourage students. I mean, I know that this goes against tenure clocks. We were both tenured when we did this and all that nonsense. But in a sense, it's something to think about because academia is also limiting certain interesting areas of research because of these tenure clocks and all these demands on junior scholars.
Thank you so much, Ariela, Alejandro. That was Alejandro. That was a wonderful excursus, I think, to end on about the virtues of collaboration, the importance of pursuing the real intellectual stakes and goals. And I just want to add, from the point of view of someone who is, drank at the fire hose of Atlantic history as an undergrad and a graduate student, this is so inspiring also as a model of how to do work that is deprovincialized, that looks beyond obvious geographic and even in some cases temporal boundaries, and really follows the questions where they take you. So I, on behalf of everyone, on behalf of the Levan and the CLHC and the Center for Latinx and Latin American Studies, I want to thank everybody for taking part today, all of the commentators, and to everyone who joined us. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you guys so much.
Getting there. Here we come. I'm going to take out the